You ever see something so familiar that it's wrong? A picture frame tilted, a door left ajar, or the steeple of 100-year-old chapel suddenly leaning like a broken neck. Sometimes the world gives you a warning. The trick is knowing how to read it before the screaming starts.
3 days ago, the afternoon sun hung low and red, casting a sickly, feverish heat over the land. Its last tired rays cut through the ancient willow trees at the edge of town, stabbing down onto the dirt road and painting strange, twisted shapes in the dust. From the porch of her run-down crossroads store, Hazel slowly fanned herself, her weary eyes fixed on the old chapel that stood not far away.
She let out a long, heavy sigh. Her wrinkled brow furrowed, and the woven fan in her hand suddenly dropped to the wooden planks of the porch. The air in Willow Creek Bend was thick and suffocating. The rare breeze that occasionally stirred did nothing but carry the oppressive heat and the acrid smell of burning fields, making the simple act of breathing a chore. The oppressive atmosphere was enough to choke anyone, but the old woman barely noticed. Her focus, her entire being, was consumed by the sight of the chapel, a structure that had stood for centuries.
With another sigh, this one laced with a deep and unsettling sorrow, Hazel muttered to herself, "It was fine just this spring. Why is the steeple crooked now? That's a bad omen, a terrible omen. This town is in for a world of heart." The memories came flooding back, unbidden, and she felt her heart begin to hammer against her ribs. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps, and the world before her swam and blurred. The fear, cold and sharp, started in her feet and spread through her entire body, making her tremble uncontrollably. For a moment, she was no longer an old woman on a porch, but a young girl again, 50 years in the past, running under that same oppressive summer sun, fleeing from the horror that had befallen Willow Creek Bend, the last time the Risen had walked among them.
She was pulled from her dark reverie by the sound of footsteps approaching the store. Shaking her head to clear the fearful thoughts, Hazel squinted. The visitor was an old man, dressed in the tattered clothes of a beggar, carrying a worn-out slide guitar. He looked as weary as the dust-choked road he just walked. He eased himself down onto a rickety stool, set his guitar beside him, and called out, "Ma'am, could I trouble you for a glass of water? This heat is a killer."
Hazel silently fetched a pitcher of cool water, poured a cup, and set it down before him. The man tilted his head back and drank it all in one go, then asked for a second. Hazel remained patient, not saying a word. After he'd finished the second cup, he asked, "How much do I owe you, ma'am?"
Hazel shook her head. She poured him a third cup and unwrapped a small pastry, placing it on a plate next to his water. "Don't you worry about that," she said, her voice a little raspy. "It's on the house today. But I wonder, would you be willing to play a song for an old woman? A traveling song?"
The old man stroked his grimy beard, and a slow smile spread across his face.
Hazel felt a small flutter of satisfaction.
This was a trade she wouldn't lose. She was old enough to know that wanderers like this often carried a hidden talent, and she had a feeling this man's skill with that guitar was something special. As requested, the old man lifted the guitar onto his lap and began to play. A haunting, mournful melody filled the air, the sound of the slide crying like a lost soul. Then he began to sing.
his voice gravelly and ancient. Oh, the clouds roll over the mountain, and the wind whispers through the pine.
The music was so raw, so filled with sorrow, that it stopped people in their tracks. A few farmers heading home from the fields paused on the road, their faces turned toward the sound. Everyone who heard it felt a shiver run down their spine, a feeling like their nerves were being pulled taut. The song ended, but the crowd stood frozen, as if in a trance. Hazel herself had tears welling in her eyes.
As the small crowd slowly dispersed, the old man took another sip of water. "A guitar has a soul, you know," he said quietly. "This one's been with me a long time. It's been my child, my friend, my only confidant. It's never left me, not even when I had nothing. It's the last comfort I'll have before I'm put in the cold ground." Hazel nodded, urging him to eat the pastry. "Do folks treat you kindly on the road?" she asked. The wanderer shook his head. "Enough to get by. I live from one day to the next. Money is just a thing. No need to worry about it. Sometimes a rich family will ask me to play at a party, but folks like that, they don't understand the soul of the music, so I usually refuse." He took a bite of chewing tobacco and spit a stream of juice, red as blood, onto the parched earth.
Slinging the guitar over his shoulder, the old man stood to leave. But as he turned, his eyes fell on the distant, crooked steeple of the chapel. He stopped, his body suddenly rigid. His cloudy eyes narrowed, focusing intently. Then, in a voice that seemed choked and forced, as if someone else were squeezing the words out of his throat, he said, "The chapel roof is bent. A great evil comes to this village. Take your children and leave. Leave now if you want to live. This will be a great tragedy."
The tone and words were so unnatural. Wanderers were usually quiet, reserved men. They didn't speak in prophecies. The fan froze in Hazel's hand. What do you mean by that?" she asked, her voice trembling. The old man suddenly flinched, as if waking from a dream. He cleared his throat. Nothing, ma'am. Just an old man's foolish ramblings. Pay me no mind. Thank you for the water." And with that, he turned and hurried away, leaving Hazel staring after him, a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She knew he wasn't just rambling. She watched until his stooped figure disappeared behind the willows, then looked back at the crooked chapel. "Whatever plague is coming," she whispered, "I pray no one has to die like they did 50 years ago. That was a horror beyond words." As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the sky and the river in shades of blood, the sound of a monastery bell began to toll from the village church, a slow, mournful peal. The quiet wouldn't last long. 2 hours later, it was shattered by the sound of weeping coming from the house of matriarch Genevieve. Almost immediately, the village began to stir. Lanterns were lit, and people made their way to the house at the far end of the lane. Inside the 3-roomed farmhouse, the matriarch's children and grandchildren were gathered, their faces streaked with tears. Outside, in the spacious front yard, a crowd of neighbors was steadily growing, coming to offer their condolences.
Matriarch Genevieve was the oldest and most respected person in Willow Creek Bend. In her long life, she had always been a pillar of kindness, always ready to help those in need. She had lived to be over 100 years old, with 4 sons and a flock of great-grandchildren. She had been bedridden for the last 6 months, and tonight she had finally passed on to the next world. Because she was so beloved,
The news of her passing brought the entire village out to mourn. Men came straight from the fields, their clothes still caked with mud. Families left their dinner tables to come and pay their respects.
Inside the bedroom, lit by the flickering glow of candles, Genevieve lay peacefully. Her eyes were closed, her mouth slightly parted. Her skin, though wrinkled, was still warm to the touch. At the head of the bed, her children had set up a small table with a single burning candle, sticks of incense sending plumes of fragrant smoke into the air, and a bowl of rice topped with a single egg, an offering for the journey ahead. The air was thick with the scent of incense, sweat, and sorrow, made heavier by the smoke from the still smoldering fields outside.
Soon, the house became too crowded, and the family elder had to ask most of the villagers to wait outside. Under a large canvas tarp, the women began brewing coffee, while the men set up tables and chairs. The funeral director was called, and the local musicians who played at wakes and funerals were summoned. A somber, mournful atmosphere settled over the entire village.
That night, the first watch over matriarch Genevieve's body began. With such a large family, they didn't need to ask the neighbors for help. 4 of her grandsons volunteered for the first vigil. But sitting with a corpse grew tiresome, and soon the 4 young men broke out a deck of cards and a bottle of whiskey. The rule was simple. Whoever lost a hand had to take a shot.
2 hours passed. By the stroke of midnight, 3 of the cousins, having lost repeatedly, were dead drunk and fast asleep, slumped over the table. A single young man was the only one left awake. Feeling the call of nature, he stood up to go out back. He remembered the funeral director's stern warning. Whatever you do, don't leave the body unattended. Don't let a black cat cross its path. It's a terrible omen.
He hesitated, but the need was urgent. The backyard wasn't far from the room where his grandmother's body lay. Reassuring himself it would be fine, he slipped out the back door. He found a large bush and began to relieve himself. As he did, he heard a rustling sound in the dry leaves to his right, coming from a dark patch of woods. He glanced over but saw nothing in the dim moonlight. Figuring it was just a raccoon, he paid it no mind.
He finished up and headed back inside, but as he reached the porch, he froze. He heard it again, a distinct scratching sound coming from inside the room where his grandmother lay. It sounded like a knife being scraped across wood. His heart pounding, he crept to the door and peered inside. The room was silent. His cousins were still asleep. Relieved, he stepped inside, thinking he must have been hearing things.
But as the door swung shut behind him, a black shape shrieked and leaped from a dark corner, rushing past his shoulder. He stumbled back, his heart nearly stopping. When he regained his composure, he saw it. Perched on the offering table was a large black cat. In the single flickering flame of the oil lamp, he could see that one of its eyes was a milky, blind white, but the other glowed with a sickening, malevolent green light. Before he could react, the cat leaped onto the coffin. With a swift, deliberate motion, it used its sharp claws to flick away the burial shroud covering his grandmother's face. Then the monstrous animal leaned down and began to lick the pale, cold lips of the corpse.
Finally, snapping out of his shock, he grabbed a broom and charged, yelling, "Get out of here, you damn beast!" The cat hissed, a sound of pure fury, dodged the broom and leaped onto a high beam.
It stared down at him with its one good eye, let out two sharp, piercing cries, and then vanished through a vent into the night.
Shaking, he cursed the animal, then set the broom down. He straightened the shroud over his grandmother's face, then lay down on his mat, his heart still racing. He tried to sleep, but couldn't. He lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling. Just as he was starting to feel his eyelids get heavy, he heard a sound that made his blood turn to ice. It was a low, guttural moan coming from behind him. It was followed by the heavy, groaning sound of the coffin lid shifting.
The family had a tradition of leaving the lid unsealed until the day of the burial so that visitors could pay their final respects. Now that heavy wooden lid was moving on its own. He was paralyzed with fear. He lay frozen, daring only to crack open his eyelids. What he saw felt like a waking nightmare. The coffin lid was indeed sliding to the side, and then, slowly, stiffly, the corpse of his grandmother sat up.
It remained motionless for a few seconds, a low, rasping breath coming from its lungs. Then, like a snake, it bent and slithered out of the coffin, landing silently on the floor. The corpse was still dressed in its burial clothes. Its jaw moved up and down, making a dry, clicking sound. But the most horrifying change was its teeth. His grandmother had been toothless for years, but now her mouth was filled with a set of sharp, white teeth, with two fangs, long and yellowed, protruding from her upper jaw. It walked on its tiptoes, its arms held stiffly in front of it. It circled the coffin once, then stopped at the offering table. In addition to the rice and fruit, a whole slaughtered pig weighing over 200 pounds lay on the table as a traditional offering. The creature lifted the pig as if it were a feather, and then, with its bare hands, it tore the massive carcass in half as easily as a man might tear a piece of paper.
It buried its face in the raw meat, tearing off huge chunks and chewing them with a savage, wet, crunching sound, groaning with satisfaction. The young man lay on the floor, shaking uncontrollably. The creature suddenly stopped chewing. Its head snapped up, and its eyes, now glowing a bloody red, scanned the room. It had heard him.
As the creature started to stalk toward the sleeping forms on the floor, a primal need for survival finally broke through his paralysis. He scrambled to his feet and ran for his life. Back in the main house, the family's eldest son was startled awake from a deep sleep. He had had a nightmare. He was standing in a thick fog, and his mother's voice was calling to him, a faint, desperate whisper. "Help me! My body! Save my body!" He sat bolt upright, drenched in sweat. It was just a dream. He got out of bed and went to the family altar in the main room, lighting 3 sticks of incense to calm his nerves.
As he bowed his head and prayed, he opened his eyes and gasped, stumbling backward and falling to the floor. For a fleeting second, in the curling smoke of the incense, he had seen her face, his mother's face, filled with sorrow and pleading with him. His shout awoke the family. They rushed out to find him huddled under the altar, babbling incoherently. It was Mother. She was here. She was crying for help. His brothers tried to calm him, telling him it was just grief and exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. But the vision and the voice from his dream felt too real. He decided he had to check on the body just to be sure.
At that same moment, the grandson was running for his life through the woods. He could hear the creature behind him.
the sound of its strange, hopping footsteps and the dry rustle of leaves as it gained on him. He could feel the pressure of its presence, a palpable wave of malice, and hear a low, guttural chuckle that turned his blood to ice. He leaped over a stone wall and sprinted toward the river, the creature easily clearing the wall in a single bound right behind him. His lungs burned. His legs felt like lead. He reached the riverbank and, without a second thought, threw himself into the churning water. But he was exhausted, his strength gone. The current caught him immediately, pulling him under into the cold, dark depths. On the riverbank, the creature stood watching, its red eyes glowing, and let out a triumphant, rasping hiss before melting back into the forest. When the family reached the vigil room, they found a scene of horror. The three cousins were still passed out on the floor. The massive pig had been torn in two, one half of it savagely gnawed. The coffin lid was askew, and the coffin itself was empty. The horrifying truth crashed down on them. "The body is gone," one of the brothers whispered, his face ashen. The eldest son remembered the stories from 50 years ago, the last time this had happened. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone what this meant. "Split up," he commanded, his voice shaking but firm. "Some of you look for your nephew. The rest, search for mother's body. Be careful and tell no one. If this gets out, the panic will destroy this village." While the family began their secret, desperate search, on the other side of the village, an old woman was woken by a sharp pain in her stomach. She lived alone with her grandnephew in a small cottage. Next to her property stood an old, abandoned house that had been empty for decades, the subject of local ghost stories about a girl who had drowned in the well behind it. After using the outhouse, she was heading back inside when she stopped dead. The hair on her arms stood on end. There, sitting by the edge of the old abandoned well, was a figure. It was a woman, dressed in a flowing white garment, her long hair unbound, staring up at the moon. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought it was the ghost of her long-dead friend. A sudden gust of wind blew, and the figure slowly turned its head. In the pale, silvery moonlight, she saw the face. It was gaunt and pale, the skin stretched tight over the bones. Its mouth was smeared with something dark and red, and its eyes were just black, empty sockets. It was not her friend. She stumbled backward, a scream catching in her throat, and fell to the ground. The figure on the other side of the fence stood up, moved with an unnatural, gliding motion, and disappeared into the overgrown yard of the abandoned house.
Her grandnephew, a brave young man, heard her fall and rushed outside. After helping his terrified aunt inside, he grabbed a lantern and a machete and went to investigate. He found no one. The only thing he found was a scrap of white cloth, the kind used for burial shrouds, snagged on a thorny bush near the fence. "It was probably just a vagrant, Aunt," he said, trying to soothe her. But she knew what she had seen. It was not a vagrant. The search for the grandson and the body continued for 2 days with no success. Then a new horror was discovered. A traveling merchant was found dead on a back road through the woods. His horse-drawn cart was overturned. His body lay in the mud, broken and violated in a way that no animal could have caused. The life and the blood seemed to have been drained from him entirely. Panic began to take hold of Willow Creek Bend. That night,
the creature struck again. It broke into the home of a young couple with a newborn child. The husband woke to find his wife dead in their bed, her neck snapped. Their baby was gone from its cradle. Mad with grief, he ran outside, and in the darkness he saw it, a tall, gaunt figure loping away towards the woods, carrying his child.
The village was on the verge of collapse. It was then, in the midst of this despair, that the grandson returned. He stumbled out of the woods, looking thin and haunted, supported by the old wandering beggar who had played the guitar at the crossroads store. The beggar introduced himself as Silas. He was a wanderer, yes, but he was also a hunter of dark things, and he had found the young man half drowned and delirious by the river and nursed him back to health.
The family confessed everything to the wanderer, the empty coffin, the secret they'd kept. He nodded grimly. The creature you face is an ancient evil. It is not your mother. It is a demon wearing her body as a suit of clothes. It is strong, cunning, and it feeds on life. The villagers, now a desperate mob, wanted to storm the abandoned house where the creature was believed to be hiding, but the wanderer stopped them.
"You cannot fight it with torches and pitchforks," he said, his voice calm but filled with authority. "It feels no pain. It has no fear, but it has a hunger, and we will use that hunger to trap it." Under his direction, they prepared the trap. They slaughtered another pig and hung its bloody entrails from the branches of a large oak tree in the clearing near the haunted house.
Around the tree, they wove a thick net of thorny vines and fishing nets, lined with hundreds of sharpened hooks. Then, as night fell, they hid and waited. Hours passed. Then they saw it. The creature emerged from the abandoned house, drawn by the smell of blood. It moved with that same unnatural, hopping gait. As it lunged for the bait, it became entangled in the net. It thrashed and shrieked, a sound of pure demonic rage. But the more it struggled, the deeper the thorns and hooks dug into its flesh.
At that moment, the wanderer stepped out of the shadows. He sat cross-legged before the struggling creature and began to chant. It wasn't a prayer they recognized, but an old, powerful hymn, the words echoing with a strange power. The creature writhed in agony, its shrieks becoming more desperate. As he hit the final, booming note of the hymn, the creature convulsed violently. A plume of thick, black smoke erupted from the corpse's mouth, hung in the air for a moment, and then dissipated into the night with a final, mournful sigh. The body of the matriarch went limp, falling slack within the net. It was over. The wanderer instructed them to burn the body immediately, right there in the woods, to ensure the evil could never return. The next day, the family held a public funeral. No one outside the family ever knew that the coffin they buried contained nothing but a straw dummy dressed in their grandmother's clothes. The secret and the horror was theirs to keep. Willow Creek Bend slowly returned to a semblance of peace, but the memory of that summer and the monster that wore a beloved face would haunt the village forever.